for the kind invitation and the kind introduction. And you made it well with the name. Let me see. Sorry. So as we were speaking on behalf of a task force for the International League Against Epilepsy on plant-based medicines, previously today we will speak a little bit more about cannabinoids and more specifically on cannabidiol. I will do the pharmacology part first, and then Finbar will talk about the clinical evidence. So I'm a pharmacologist, so I work with how the drugs are working and how does the body receive and how the body works with the drug. And here we have some major challenges as well. So we have a few disclosures, and we will see. So a little bit about a history of how we got this new drug, and actually a regulatory approved drug, Epidiolex, containing pure cannabidiol, or abbreviated CBD. So from the cannabis plant, it contains different compounds, and it's been well known and anecdotally used since ancient times in various therapeutic aspects. Then cannabidiol itself was isolated in the 1960s, and slowly some evidence came up from a few studies that this might be effective in epilepsy. Then cannabidiol enriched cannabis plants was cultivated, and they could isolate larger amounts of pure cannabidiol, and it's very fat soluble. That's why it's in oil solution. And furthermore, the pharmacological properties of cannabidiol itself, and also the active metabolite, which is called 7-hydroxy cannabidiol, has been investigated. And then lastly, clinical trials led to the approval of a drug in severe epilepsies, and this is what Finbar will talk about afterwards. So I will talk a little bit more about how this drug works and how it affects our body. So mechanism of action of cannabidiol. Here you see a synapse, the connection point of neurons, and there are a lot of arrows and small boxes with all commonly used anti-seizure medications. And you see in the red cannabidiol on the side here, so it actually has other mechanisms of action in the brain than commonly used drugs. More in detail, here you see one synapse enlarged, and of course most compounds that work in the central nervous system, they might affect various targets and work in several ways. And for cannabidiol, this has been and is also being further investigated. But three major mechanisms of action have been postulated: that they regulate calcium inside the cells, which is important for how the neurons will fire, and also regulate adenosine, which is a neuromodulator, also affecting the balance between inhibition and excitation in the brain. And altogether, these effects in the neurons might suppress the seizure activity. Pharmacokinetics, or PK, that's the processes that the body does with the drug when we take it. So you see a drop of the oily solution of cannabidiol here to the absorption process from the gastrointestinal pathway to the distribution in the whole body, in the blood, and to the brain where it's supposed to work. And it's widely distributed in the body because it's so fat soluble. Then it's metabolized in the liver and finally excreted as more water-soluble molecules. You see some circles here and also across at the absorption, because the absorption process is quite poor. It's poorly soluble. It has a large degree of first-pass metabolism in the liver, so it goes fast and will be inactivated. And it's largely also affected by food intake. So if you eat some fat-rich food together with cannabidiol, the uptake to the blood will increase 3 to 4-fold. So that's why to our both patient and healthcare information from our center in Norway, we have recommendation on how to use it, and also some supplements, recommendations with some food that might be taken together with cannabidiol, and recommendations of using the same kind of food together with cannabidiol to increase and give a stable uptake of the drug. It's bound to proteins in the blood, and that will affect the distribution, but that's not a major point here. And regarding metabolism, there are interactions with other drugs used at the same time. Cannabidiol itself is a strong enzyme inhibitor, so it will inhibit the transformation of other drugs and increasing those drugs like clobazam or everolimus. And there are also two-way interactions with other drugs affecting cannabidiol, so it's a tricky drug to handle. And the dose that you give is a quite poor approximation of how the exposure in the body will be. It's also some interactions with the genes, because a few patients have a poor capacity of metabolizing drugs in certain enzymes, and that may also increase the exposure and increase the risk of having adverse effects. So this is one safety measure, and also measuring liver enzymes is another safety measure to ensure that our patients get safe treatment and follow-up. When it comes to regulatory approval, and since this is an international conference, there are large differences across the world, or whether cannabidiol or the product Epidiolex is available. So from 2018, the Food and Drug Administration in the US approved cannabidiol first, or Epidiolex. Then in 2019, the European Medicines Agency approved it, and in Australia from 2020, it was also approved for then 2 and now 3 indications, and Finbar will talk about the regulatory trials behind them. So with that, I think I will give the word to my colleague Finbar, and he will tell you about the clinical evidence.
Thank you. Having had the big build-up from Peter about my name, as soon as I open my mouth, you realise that I sound English. But don't be fooled, I belong to Cork, really. As we've already mentioned, cannabis-based medicines have been around for millennia, and people have realised their therapeutic potential for a long time. And indeed, back in the 19th century, physicians were using cannabis-based medicinal products, and specifically in epilepsy. So there's a very famous neurologist from the Institute of Neurology in London, William Gowers, in the 19th century, and he wrote quite extensively about the use of cannabis-based medicines for the treatment of epilepsy. But it kind of fell out of favour in the 20th century. Before there was a kind of rebirth in popular consciousness in the 21st century, and not least because of high-profile cases that hit the media. And I've highlighted there Charlotte Figge, who's on the left of your screen, who's a young girl with Dravet syndrome in Colorado, who derived major benefit in terms of reduction of seizures associated with the use of a cannabis-based medicinal product. Patients with refractory epilepsy still represent about a third of our patients with epilepsy. And that's despite an explosion of conventional anti-seizure medications in the second half of the 20th century and the first 2 decades of the 21st century. So about a third of patients have refractory epilepsy, and obviously this is an unmet clinical need and is a big problem for the patients, obviously, and their parents and family, but also for the clinicians looking after them. They're not the only actors in this space now with cannabis-based medicinal products. There are now pressure groups pushing for the use of various different products. There are politicians whose motives may be pure, just representing the interests of their constituents, or maybe slightly less pure. There are clinician enthusiasts for the use of cannabis-based medicinal products, and there is significant commercial interest. This is a multi-billion-pound industry, both medicinally and recreationally, and they have formed links with all these different actors. So it's quite a complicated space that we are working in at the moment. So what is the evidence? So first of all, I think we need to draw a distinction between the different types of cannabis-based medicinal products out there. So there are artisanal products, which are manufactured in a lab that wouldn't meet the standards for pharmaceutical products, and they have varying amounts of cannabidiol and tetrahydrocannabinol in them, and the concentrations may vary from batch to batch. And indeed, the concentrations that are listed on the label of the product may not match the concentrations that are actually in the product in the bottle. And then there are pharmaceutical grade products that do meet the requirements of manufacturing and distribution practice demanded by regulatory industries and authorities. There are defined amounts of CBD and or THC that don't vary significantly from batch to batch in these products. The ingredients in the bottle tend to match what's listed on the label, and notable examples of these types of products are like Epidiolex, pure CBD, Bedrocan products, Tilray products, and there are others. We also need to distinguish between the whole plant products and the extracted isolates. So whole plant products are products that contain both cannabidiol, THC, and indeed many other cannabinoids, and the aromatic hydrocarbons, the terpenes, that give these products the characteristic smell. And there are people who believe that you need all these constituents in your medicine to achieve the maximal therapeutic effect. And they talk about the entourage effect. And then you have extracted isolates. So pure CBD, Epidiolex, the CBD plus THC, there's a product called Sativex, CBDV, cannabidivarin, and so on. When talking about the evidence, I think it's probably worth talking about how the regulatory authorities and indeed the medical profession look at clinical evidence. And this is the so-called pyramid of evidence. And at the top of the pyramid, you have the level of evidence that's required generally by regulatory authorities to license medicines. And once medicines are licensed, then it's likely that health systems will start to pay for them. Unfortunately, the majority of evidence for most cannabis-based medicinal products, the evidence lies at the bottom of the pyramid. So this is kind of expert opinion or case reports and case series. And this type of evidence isn't usually accepted by regulatory authorities because it is prone to bias. There have, however, been some level 1 evidence of specifically pure cannabidiol in 3 rare epilepsy syndromes. So the first randomized controlled trial of cannabidiol was in Dravet syndrome. So this is the condition that Charlotte Figge had. It's a double-blind randomized controlled trial in children and young adults with this condition. 120 were randomized either to cannabidiol, 61 of them, or 59 of them to placebo. And the median difference in seizure frequency between those on CBD versus those on placebo was 22.8%. and this was a statistically significant difference. The percentage of patients with a 50% reduction in convulsive seizures during the trial, 43% who were taking cannabidiol versus 27% of those who were on placebo. Next area, same product, so this is pure CBD, Epidiolex, randomized controlled trial in Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. So this is a particularly severe form of epilepsy. There may be multiple underlying causes or conditions that lead onto the epilepsy syndrome, Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, but traditionally are very difficult to treat. So this is a double-blind randomized controlled trial. Again, patients were aged between 2 and 55 years of age. They had to meet specific diagnostic criteria to get into the trial, both in terms of what you saw on the EEG and in terms of the seizure types and the amount of seizures they were having. And there are 171 patients randomized in this trial. 86 got cannabidiol, 85 got placebo. Trial took there's a 14-week treatment period during the trial. And the main outcome was to look at the percentage reduction in drop seizure frequency from the baseline period. And they saw again a significant effect. With cannabidiol, you had a 43.9% reduction in drop seizures versus 21.8% on placebo. And if you look at the median difference in seizure frequency between the treatment groups of 17.21%, again, that was statistically significant. And then finally, the third area that they looked at Epidiolex in was in refractory epilepsy related to tuberous sclerosis complex. Tuberous sclerosis, as many of you will know, is a genetic condition which is associated with formation of benign tumours, hamartomas in multiple organs of the body, but critically in the brain, and those hamartomas are associated often with a very difficult to treat epilepsy. About 2/3 of patients with tuberous sclerosis will have refractory epilepsy. This trial was slightly different. It was using Epidiolex, and again, it was a double-blind, randomized controlled trial, but they were looking at 2 dosing regimes, a low dose or lower dose regime of cannabidiol, a higher dose regime of cannabidiol, and placebo. And what they saw was that both the cannabidiol treatment groups had a significantly better percentage seizure reduction compared to placebo, 47 or 48% versus about 27% on placebo. So 3 international well-conducted randomized controlled trials. What can we draw in terms of conclusions from these trials? Well, it does appear that cannabidiol is an effective anti-seizure medication and works across a range of different seizure types. The pharmaceutical company that developed this product specifically wanted to investigate in these rare disease areas because it was a faster route to licensing. And that, you can understand why they made that decision, but the consequence of that is that in some countries now, we can only use this product, cannabidiol or Epidiolex, in these 3 rare clinical scenarios. So Dravet syndrome, Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, or tuberous sclerosis, although many clinicians will believe that they may be effective in other forms of other epilepsies and other conditions. The low-dose regimes in the trial appear to be as effective as the high-dose regimes. There was a clinical interaction with clobazam, but it's important to say that cannabidiol itself had a significant therapeutic effect independently of the clobazam. And it's also worth mentioning that manufacturers of other pharmaceutical-grade products containing both CBD and THC have so far not been willing and not been able to conduct or participate in randomized controlled trials. So there's a very real gap in our knowledge in terms of level 1 evidence of whether cannabinoid products containing THC are both effective and safe. I just want to mention the placebo effect because this is a very real thing. Placebos can lead to symptom relief for all sorts of different reasons. That doesn't mean that people are putting it on or anything. The placebos do work to an extent for all sorts of different reasons. It's important, I think, to acknowledge that in the cannabinoid area or cannabis-based medicinal product area, the placebo effect is larger than you see in most conventional anti-seizure medications. So in the trial that I was talking about with Dravet syndrome, 27% of patients on placebo had a 50% reduction in seizure frequency. Okay, that's about twice what we'd normally expect to see in anti-seizure medication trials. And indeed, there's a trial, Martin Brodie did a trial of the product cannabidivarin, CBDV, in refractory epilepsy in adults, refractory focal seizures in adults. And those on placebo had a 37.7% reduction in seizure frequency compared to 40.5% on CBDV, i.e. they couldn't demonstrate a difference between the active product and placebo. And as a result of that, CBDV, the company have not gone on to develop CBDV as an anti-seizure medication, even though it may have an effect. It's just that the placebo effect was so high. Professor Landmark has already highlighted that CBD is a potent inhibitor of the cytochrome P450 enzyme system, and the net effect of that is it increases circulating levels of the active metabolite of clobazam. So if a patient's taking clobazam as well, you have to be aware of that interaction. And also, and this is relevant to tuberous sclerosis patients, that it will also affect the level of the mTOR inhibitors everolimus and sirolimus, and you may need to make dose alterations in that. So what have we learned? Well, there are great expectations of plant-based medicine for epilepsy, for these cannabis-based medicinal products, and that's based on a whole raft of case reports and case series, and indeed historical knowledge from many years ago. There are discrepancies between the artisanal products and the regulatory or the pharmaceutical grade products, and certainly Epidiolex, which is a regulatory approved drug. There's a lack of evidence from RCTs or randomized controlled trials for products other than cannabidiol. And again, I'd make a plea for the industry partners who are making pharmaceutical grade products containing CBD and THC to participate in clinical trials. And our experience in the clinical use of cannabidiol in Dravet syndrome, Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, and tuberous sclerosis would lead us to believe that actually this medication may be effective in other epilepsies and a wider number of patients than we can currently prescribe. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Finbar, and indeed Cecilie as well. A couple of questions again. So is there any evidence, or is there new evidence that after a while at a maintenance dose of Epidiolex that you may need to reduce the dose in order to get effect?
To reduce the dose?
To reduce the dose is the question.
To maintain the effect? I'm not aware of any evidence that you'd have to do that. I'm certainly aware of some clinical anecdotal evidence that maybe the effect wears off over time.
Sure.
But not the other way.
And one here that's actually similar to a question I think was asked earlier. Is THC an anti-epileptic drug as well, and have trials been done? And I suppose to add to it, why is it, or can you address the point maybe in some way as to why some of the products that are out there, obviously for both speakers, why some of these products have not made it to the stage of RCTs?
Sure. Okay. So I will, first of all, yes, there is evidence, preclinical evidence, that THC can have an anticonvulsant effect, but also has to be said that there are some animal models in which it's been shown to be pro-convulsant as well. Why there haven't been any randomized controlled trials looking at CBD THC products, and that's to a certain extent why the regulatory authorities haven't licensed products and why various healthcare systems won't pay for it, if you see what I mean. Professor Landmark might want to comment on how THC might work.
Well, I pointed out that CBD works in specific targets in the brain, and it's been shown that THC might work in other receptors, and that they work differently. I think also that, well, for safety reasons, exposure of THC might also affect development and have a negative impact when it's used in children. So the evidence is low, and there has been better evidence regarding safety to use CBD. But in other countries, or in many countries, there are different products available with different compositions of CBD and THC, but they are not regulatory approved drugs then.